2007, three friends, Jason, Eric, and Vanessa, embarked on what was supposed to be a peaceful weekend retreat in the Appalachian Mountains. They rented a remote cabin deep in the woods, disconnected from cell service, with nothing but the sounds of nature to keep them company. The area was known for its beauty, but also its strange folklore. Stories about hikers disappearing, shadowy figures in the trees, and whispers carried on the wind. None of them believed in such tales. They were there for relaxation and a break from their mundane city lives. The first night passed uneventfully. They grilled burgers, played cards, and joked about the legends. But by the second night, things took a turn that would haunt those who survived forever. While sitting by the campfire, Vanessa mentioned that she thought she saw someone standing at the edge of the woods earlier that day. Jason and Eric laughed it off, teasing her about mountain hermits. But she insisted. "I'm serious. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a person. Or something." Her voice faltered, and the uneasy look in her eyes made the laughter fade. Later that night, as the three tried to sleep in their separate rooms, they began hearing noises outside the cabin. It started with faint rustling, then distinct snapping of branches, as if something or someone was circling the building. Jason, always the brave one, grabbed a flashlight and headed outside. "Probably just a raccoon," he muttered. But when he opened the cabin door, he froze. The flashlight beam swept across the tree line, and for a split second, they all saw it. A pale figure standing perfectly still, just beyond the trees. It wasn't moving, but its head was tilted unnaturally to one side, as if observing them. Jason quickly slammed the door shut. "What the hell was that?" Vanessa whispered, clutching Eric's arm. "I don't know," Jason said, locking the door and checking all the windows. "But it's not an animal." The three stayed huddled in the living room, the fire from the fireplace their only source of light. Hours passed in tense silence, but the noises didn't return. By dawn, they convinced themselves it was a prank. Maybe some local kids trying to scare tourists. They decided to shake it off and go for the hike they had planned. The trail was beautiful, but eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of their boots on the path. Vanessa couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. She kept glancing over her shoulder, and once, she swore she saw movement in the trees. But every time she tried to point it out, Jason and Eric dismissed her concerns. As they reached a clearing, they found something that stopped them cold. In the middle of the path was a crude arrangement of sticks and stones, forming a symbol none of them recognized. It looked deliberate, ritualistic. "Okay, that's weird," Jason admitted. "But maybe it's just some hiker leaving a marker." Vanessa wasn't convinced. She took pictures with her camera, but when she tried to review them, the screen flickered, and the images wouldn't load. Frustrated and uneasy, the group decided to turn back. The return hike was faster, but no less unsettling. The forest felt alive, as if it were closing in on them. Shadows moved where there shouldn't be movement, and faint whispers seemed to drift on the wind, though no one spoke. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long, menacing shadows. That night, the noises returned, only louder. Something scraped against the windows, and the sound of heavy breathing echoed around the cabin. Jason, armed with a kitchen knife, opened the front door, determined to confront whatever was out there. "Stay inside," he told Vanessa and Eric. Minutes passed. Then a blood-curdling scream tore through the night. Vanessa and Eric rushed to the door but found nothing outside. No Jason, no signs of a struggle, only the knife lying in the dirt. Panic set in. They locked the doors and windows, barricading themselves inside. Vanessa wanted to call for help, but Eric reminded her they had no signal. "We'll leave at first light," he promised. The rest of the night was a blur of terror. The whispers grew louder, now coming from inside the cabin. Doors creaked open on their own, and the fire inexplicably went out, plunging them into darkness. Vanessa swore she saw Jason standing in the hallway at one point, but when she turned on the flashlight, no one was there. By morning, they couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing what they could, they ran to the car only to find its tires slashed. Desperate, they decided to follow the road on foot, hoping to find help or at least signal for their phones. Hours later, they stumbled upon a park ranger station. They babbled their story, but the rangers were skeptical. "That cabin's been abandoned for years," one of them said. "No one rents it out anymore." Vanessa insisted they had stayed there, even describing the interior in detail. The rangers agreed to investigate and drove them back to the site. But when they arrived, the cabin was gone. Only a foundation remained, overgrown with weeds and moss, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. To this day, neither Vanessa nor Eric can explain what happened that weekend. Jason was never found. Some locals believe they stumbled upon something ancient, something that doesn't want to be found. Whatever it was, it left 2 survivors with scars they'll never forget, and a mystery that remains unsolved. They say small towns keep their secrets buried deep. For the residents of Glenwood, a quiet village nestled in the Appalachian foothills, that secret was a well. Locals avoided it, passed it by with hushed warnings, and dared each other as children to peek inside. But none ever stayed long enough to hear what lingered in the darkness below. This story begins with Peter, a freelance photographer who had just moved to Glenwood to escape the chaos of city life. He rented a cozy cabin on the edge of town, surrounded by dense forest and solitude. A dream for someone seeking inspiration. Peter quickly befriended his neighbor, Henry, a grizzled old man who seemed to know everything about the town's history. One crisp autumn evening, as they shared beers on Henry's porch, the topic of the well came up. "Stay away from it," Henry warned, his voice gravelly and firm. "It's bad luck, always has been." "What's the story?" Peter asked, intrigued. His photographer's eye immediately envisioned the eerie potential of a well in the middle of nowhere. Henry leaned back, exhaling smoke from his cigarette. "They say a man fell in a long time ago. But the thing is, he didn't die. Not all the way, at least. Folks who get too close swear they hear him whispering, asking for help. And those who answer, they never come back." Peter chuckled nervously. "Sounds like a local ghost story." Henry's expression darkened. "It's not a story." The next morning, Peter couldn't shake the thought of the well. He grabbed his camera and set off into the woods, following Henry's vague directions. It wasn't long before he stumbled upon it, a moss-covered stone circle in a clearing, the wooden cover rotting and half-sunken into the ground. The air felt heavy, the kind of oppressive stillness that makes your skin crawl. Peter hesitated, but his curiosity got the better of him. He approached cautiously, peering into the black void below. The smell hit him first, damp, earthy, with an underlying rot. He shined his flashlight down and saw nothing but stone walls descending into darkness. "Help me," a voice whispered. Peter froze. The voice was faint, barely audible over the pounding of his heart. It wasn't the wind or his imagination. It was real. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. "Is someone down there?" "Please, help." The voice was pleading now, desperate. Peter felt a chill run down his spine. Against his better judgment, he grabbed the rope tied to the well's side and began lowering himself in. The smell grew stronger as he descended, and the light from above faded until he was enveloped in darkness. Halfway down, the rope jerked violently. Peter nearly lost his grip, and his flashlight slipped from his hand, spiraling into the abyss. He held on for dear life, panic setting in. Then, he felt it. A hand, cold and slimy, grabbing his ankle. Peter screamed and scrambled back up the rope, his muscles burning with effort. He burst out of the well, gasping for air, and stumbled backward into the dirt. The clearing was silent again, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. He grabbed his camera and ran back to the cabin without looking back. That night, Peter reviewed the photos he had taken. Most were ordinary shots of the forest and the well, but one made his blood run cold. In the shadows beyond the well, just barely visible, was a figure. A man. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and his mouth twisted in an unnatural scream. Peter couldn't sleep. The image haunted him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him back. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, made his heart race. At 3 a.m., he heard it again. "Help me." This time, the voice wasn't coming from the woods. It was inside the cabin. Peter grabbed his flashlight and crept through the darkened rooms, his breath shallow and his hands shaking. The voice grew louder, more insistent, as he approached the basement door. The doorknob was ice cold. Summoning every ounce of courage, he yanked it open and shone the light down the stairs. At the bottom stood the man from the well. His face was pale, his clothes tattered and soaked, and his eyes locked onto Peter with an intensity that froze him in place. "You shouldn't have looked," the man whispered. Suddenly the basement seemed to stretch, the walls closing in, and Peter felt himself being pulled forward. He stumbled back, slamming the door shut and bolting it. The whispers didn't stop, though. They grew louder, filling the cabin, until Peter couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his car keys and fled into the night. He didn't stop driving until he reached Henry's house. Pounding on the door, he screamed for help. When Henry finally opened it, Peter babbled incoherently about the man, the well, and the photos. Henry's face went pale as he listened. "You're marked now," Henry said grimly. "You can't run from it." Peter didn't understand, but he stayed at Henry's that night, too terrified to go back to the cabin. When dawn broke, Henry took Peter back to the well, armed with a shotgun and a bundle of sage. They found the clearing empty, but the well's cover was completely gone. "I told you to stay away," Henry muttered, tossing the sage into the well and muttering a prayer. He turned to Peter. "You need to leave Glenwood, tonight." Peter packed his things and left that very day, driving until he couldn't recognize the landscape anymore. But even miles away, the whispers followed him. They were in his car, his motel room, his dreams. Whatever was in that well hadn't stayed behind. Peter didn't last a week after leaving Glenwood. No matter where he went, miles away, different states, different motels, the whispers persisted. Sometimes they were faint, a barely audible plea drifting through an open window. Other times, they were deafening, accompanied by slamming doors, flickering lights, and the feeling of icy hands brushing his skin. Desperation drove Peter back to the photos he had taken at the well. He scoured every image, looking for answers, a clue, anything that might explain what was happening. That's when he noticed something he hadn't seen before. In each photo, the figure in the shadows was moving closer, frame by frame, until it was no longer in the well. It was standing right behind him. Peter dropped the photos, his heart hammering in his chest. His reflection in the motel mirror caught his eye. Slowly, he turned to face it, and his blood ran cold. The man from the well was standing behind him, his hollow eyes boring into Peter's. Before he could scream, the lights went out, plunging the room into total darkness. When the lights flickered back on, Peter was gone. Days later, the motel manager entered the room. responding to complaints of an awful smell. Inside, he found Peter's belongings scattered everywhere, the photos still lying on the desk. The smell was strongest near the bathroom. When the manager opened the door, he recoiled in horror. There, in the bathtub, was a crude stone well, its jagged edges dripping with stagnant water. And from deep within its shadows, a voice whispered, "Help me." Authorities investigated, but Peter's case went cold. The well in the bathtub defied logic. It seemed to vanish as mysteriously as it appeared, leaving only the foul stench of decay behind. Years later, rumors about the Glenwood well persisted. Some claimed to hear the whispers during storms. Others swore they saw Peter's pale face staring up at them when they dared to look inside. Locals knew better than to linger too long. But every once in a while, a curious outsider ignored the warnings, drawn by the promise of adventure or answers. None of them ever came back. It started as an urban legend that no one truly believed, except for those who had seen it with their own eyes. A hotel room that didn't appear on any registry, never had a key, and yet, people kept disappearing inside. The hotel Castor stood at the edge of a small, forgotten town, nestled between a forest and a decaying industrial park. Once a grand centerpiece for travelers, it had deteriorated into a shadow of its former self, its cracked facade and dimly lit lobby reflecting years of neglect. Most locals avoided it, claiming the place was cursed. But for travelers unaware of its reputation, the Castor was just a cheap room for the night. That's exactly what lured in Brian and Melissa, a young couple on a cross-country road trip. It was late. The roads were slick with rain, and the glowing neon vacancy sign was a beacon of relief. They were greeted by the night manager, a gaunt man whose expression never wavered between indifferent and eerily vacant. "Room 303, he said, sliding a key across the counter. Brian pocketed it without noticing the man's trembling hand. Melissa, however, lingered. How many people are staying here tonight? The manager didn't look up. Just you. The couple exchanged a glance. We'll be out early, Brian added nervously, before they climbed the creaking staircase to the third floor. Room 303 was a relic of the past, faded wallpaper peeling at the edges, an old CRT television sitting on a wobbly stand, and a faint, musty smell that hinted at decades of poor ventilation. Melissa wrinkled her nose as Brian flopped onto the bed. It's just one night, he mumbled, scrolling through his phone. Melissa sat by the window, staring at the parking lot below. I don't like this place. It feels off. You've seen too many horror movies, Brian teased, though he kept his own unease to himself. The strange silence of the hotel, the way the hallway lights buzzed faintly. He felt it too, but he wouldn't admit it. When Melissa pulled back the thin curtains to close them, she froze. Brian, she whispered. There's someone out there. Brian shot up and joined her. In the parking lot, just beyond the pool of light cast by the neon sign, a figure stood motionless. It was impossible to make out details, but the silhouette was unmistakably human. Probably just the manager, Brian said, trying to sound casual. But as he said it, the figure began to walk, not toward the hotel but sideways, almost drifting, until it disappeared into the shadows. Let's lock the door, Melissa said, her voice tight. Brian nodded. That night, sleep didn't come easily for either of them. Every creak, every distant sound from the pipes seemed magnified in the oppressive quiet. Melissa lay awake, staring at the ceiling, while Brian snored softly beside her. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching them. At 3:03 a.m., Melissa's phone buzzed on the nightstand. She grabbed it quickly, trying not to wake Brian. The screen showed a message from an unknown number. "Are you awake?" Her stomach dropped. She looked around the room, then out the window, but saw nothing. Assuming it was a prank, she turned off the phone and set it face down. The knocking started 10 minutes later. It was faint at first, like someone tapping with a single knuckle. Melissa held her breath, hoping it was just her imagination. But the knocking grew louder and more insistent, coming from the wall next to the bed. She shook Brian awake. "What is it?" he groaned. "Listen," she hissed. The knocking stopped. Brian sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Probably just the pipes." "Brian, it's not the pipes," Melissa insisted. "It's coming from inside the wall." Before Brian could respond, the lights flickered, and the room was plunged into total darkness. Melissa grabbed her phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the space. The air felt heavy, suffocating. Then, they heard it. A slow, deliberate scratching, like nails being dragged across wood. It was coming from the closet. Brian stood, his legs unsteady, and approached the door. "It's probably an animal or something." "Don't open it," Melissa pleaded, but he ignored her. When he swung the door open, it was empty. No shelves, no hangers, just darkness stretching into nothingness. He stepped back, confused. That doesn't make any sense," he stammered. "I could have sworn—" Before he could finish, the door slammed shut on its own. Brian yelped and tried to pull it open, but it wouldn't budge. "What's happening?" Melissa cried, shining her flashlight around the room. The walls were rippling, almost breathing, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Brian banged on the closet door, screaming for help, but then he froze. From inside, a voice whispered, "Help me, please." It was Melissa's voice. "Melissa," Brian said, his voice trembling. "Are you in there?" "What are you talking about? I'm right here!" Melissa shouted, standing by the bed. Brian turned to her, his face pale. "Then who's in the closet?" The whispering grew louder, overlapping with more voices, each one crying out for help. The walls trembled, the floor creaked, and the air was filled with an unbearable pressure. The door to the room flew open, and standing there was the night manager, his face contorted in terror. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. "You need to leave now." "What's going on?" Melissa screamed. "It's the room," the manager said. "It doesn't want you to leave." Just as he spoke, the closet door burst open, revealing a swirling void of darkness. From it emerged dozens of hands, gnarled, skeletal, and dripping with black liquid. They reached for Brian, pulling him toward the void. "Melissa, run!" Brian shouted as he struggled against the hands, but the room itself seemed alive, bending and shifting to trap them both. Melissa screamed as Brian's legs disappeared into the gaping void of the closet. The skeletal hands clawed at his shoulders, dragging him further into the blackness. The walls of the room pulsed and moaned as if alive, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood. "Melissa!" Brian's voice was ragged, filled with desperation. He reached out a trembling hand toward her. "Don't let go!" Melissa lunged, grabbing his wrist with both hands. She pulled with every ounce of strength she had, tears streaming down her face. The skeletal hands recoiled at her touch, as if her very presence burned them. But more emerged, reaching, grasping, pulling Brian deeper. The night manager shouted over the chaos, his voice hoarse and panicked. "It feeds on fear. Don't let it take him. You have to fight it." Melissa's mind raced, her thoughts a tangled web of terror and determination. "Brian, stay with me. Don't you dare give up." Her words seemed to spark something in Brian. His free hand shot out, gripping the edge of the closet doorframe. With a guttural roar, he heaved his body upward, the skeletal hands screeching in protest. Melissa pulled harder, her knuckles white, her muscles screaming in agony. The room fought back. The floor buckled beneath her feet and a deep guttural growl emanated from the walls. Shadows slithered along the ceiling, their forms shifting and writhing, growing larger and more menacing with every passing second. "Get out now!" the night manager screamed. He stepped forward, throwing a handful of salt into the closet. The black void recoiled, the skeletal hands retreating with shrill, otherworldly cries. "It's your only chance! Run!" With one final pull, Melissa yanked Brian free. They tumbled onto the floor, gasping for air, their bodies trembling from the ordeal. The closet door slammed shut, the walls trembling violently as the void inside fought to escape. The manager grabbed Melissa and Brian by their arms, hauling them to their feet. "Go! Now!" The trio bolted from the room, the hallway stretching unnaturally long before them. The lights flickered, and the shadows from the walls stretched and clawed, reaching for them. The air buzzed with whispers, incoherent and maddening. Behind them, the door to room 303 splintered open. A torrent of black smoke poured out, carrying with it the wails of countless lost souls. The walls cracked and bled, the carpet beneath their feet bubbling as if alive. "Faster!" the manager yelled, shoving them forward. The staircase seemed to go on forever, but they finally reached the lobby. As soon as they crossed the threshold, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The air was clearer, the silence no longer suffocating. Melissa and Brian stumbled into the parking lot, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. "Keep moving," the manager urged. "Don't stop until you're far away." They didn't need to be told twice. Brian started the car with shaking hands, Melissa clinging to his arm. As they sped away, the hotel loomed in the rearview mirror, its windows glowing faintly with an unnatural red light. Miles down the road, Brian finally pulled over. They sat in stunned silence, the events replaying in their minds like a horrific nightmare. "What the hell was that?" Melissa whispered, her voice shaking. Brian didn't respond. He stared at the hotel key in his hand, the one he distinctly remembered leaving on the nightstand in room 303. Etched into the metal was a single word: yours. Back at the hotel, the night manager stood in the empty lobby, staring at the registry book. The pages were blank. He exhaled shakily and locked the front door, muttering to himself, "It won't be long before it finds someone else." As he turned to leave, a faint knocking echoed from the direction of room 303. His shoulders slumped, and he whispered under his breath, "I'm so sorry." The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Then it stopped. The manager froze, his body rigid as he turned to face the front desk. The bell on the counter dinged, and a voice that wasn't his own whispered, "Next."